The torchlight flickered against stone walls, casting long shadows across the chamber, where silence spoke louder than words. Outside, the toll of church bells echoed across the sleeping town, calling souls to prayer even as bodies stirred restlessly in the dark. In the hushed air of medieval Europe, where incense mingled with the scent of sweat and straw, a question lingered. Was desire a divine gift or a curse upon humanity? The Middle Ages are often remembered as an age of faith, castles, and battles. Yet beneath the banners of crusaders and the solemn hymns of monasteries lay another world, one far less sanctified, the realm of human intimacy. It was a realm both whispered and forbidden, where the church declared lust a mortal danger, yet men and women continued to seek warmth in the night. This contradiction between spirit and flesh defined the medieval experience of sex. The world of contradictions. In the medieval mind, sexuality existed at the crossroads of sin and survival. For the clergy, it was a battlefield of temptation. For peasants, it was bound to fertility and survival. For nobles, it was entangled with power and scandal. Medieval society did not ignore sex. It obsessed over it, legislated it, punished it, and mythologized it. Desire was treated like fire, dangerous, capable of destruction, yet necessary for warmth and life. The church's watchful eye. From cathedral pulpits, priests thundered against fornication, adultery, and sodomy. Manuals of confession probed into the most intimate details of marital life. Days of abstinence were prescribed sometimes over half the calendar year. Yet reality often ignored doctrine. Even among those sworn to celibacy, temptation found its way in. The cloister walls could not entirely silence the body. The lives of the common folk. For peasants, sex unfolded without privacy. Families often shared a single bed. Thin walls carried whispers from one household to the next, and marriage was less a union of passion than a contract of necessity. Still, songs, dances, and seasonal rituals carried undertones of fertility and sensuality. Amid famine, plague, and toil, intimacy remained one of the few sparks of joy, whispers of forbidden love. At court, troubadours sang of yearning knights and unattainable ladies, crafting an ideal of love that was rarely consummated yet filled with erotic longing. At the same time, scandals rippled through royal chambers, with mistresses and secret liaisons shaping dynasties. The fantasy of purity coexisted with the reality of desire. The hidden histories. There were also stories deliberately erased or silenced of same-sex bonds, of women accused of witchcraft for the power of their allure, of brothels licensed by city councils and taxed by kings. Medieval sexuality was not a monolith of repression, but a tapestry woven of contradictions, a mirror to our own time. Looking back, one might ask, were people of the Middle Ages so different from us? They lived under stricter codes, yes, but their hearts burned with familiar longings. They wrestled with guilt, with secrecy, with the pull of passion against the weight of morality. The echoes of their struggles still resound in our present debates about sex, freedom, and shame. The journey ahead. In this chronicle, we will travel through villages and castles, monasteries and brothels, courts and festivals. We will meet kings whose beds determined kingdoms, peasants who loved, despite the watchful eye of the priest, women who used their allure as survival, and men who risked punishment for forbidden desire. Each chapter will peel back a layer of medieval life, revealing how sex silent in official chronicles was nevertheless at the core of human existence. Closing reflection. The Middle Ages were an era where shadows of guilt mingled with the fire of longing. To study their intimacy is to confront a truth. Humanity cannot live by spirit alone. We are flesh and soul, bound by fate, yet forever searching for tenderness in the dark. Perhaps that is the enduring question, whether love redeems desire, or whether desire itself is the truest expression of being human. The sound of bells summoned the faithful to the cathedral, their deep resonance rolling across villages and towns like waves of authority. Within those stone walls, where stained glass saints glowed in colored light, priests spoke with certainty about the dangers of the flesh. To the medieval church, the body was a vessel of sin, its passions a battlefield where salvation or damnation was decided. And yet behind cloistered doors and within whispered confessions, the same priests often knew how fragile that ideal was. The Church's grip on intimacy. The medieval Catholic Church held unparalleled authority over daily life. It prescribed what foods could be eaten, what days were holy, and most importantly, what acts in the bedroom were permitted. Sexual intimacy was never regarded as a simple natural act. It was tolerated only within marriage, and only for the purpose of procreation. Desire itself was often framed as suspect, a residue of humanity's fall from Eden. Theologians like Augustine had long declared that lust corrupted even lawful unions. To feel pleasure was to stray close to sin. To seek it deliberately was dangerous. Thus, even married couples were expected to approach their union with restraint. Many calendars of penance outlined days when sex was strictly forbidden: during Lent, Advent, feast days, Sundays, Fridays, and even on the eves of major saints' days. Added together, these prohibitions left barely half the year safe for marital intimacy. Confession and control. Confession manuals of the Middle Ages reveal a startling obsession with the intimate details of the laity's lives. Priests were instructed to question penitents not only about adultery or fornication, but also about how, when, and in what manner they had been with their spouses. Questions probed the private chambers of men and women alike. Had they sought pleasure or resisted it? Had they performed the act unnaturally, that is, in positions not sanctioned by custom? Such manuals, intended to guide priests, reveal more than the Church intended. They show a society deeply aware of its own appetites, caught between fear of eternal damnation and the undeniable pull of desire. The priest and the flesh. Ironically, the very men charged with upholding celibacy were themselves vulnerable to temptation. By the high Middle Ages, priestly celibacy was official doctrine, yet across Europe, countless records describe priests who kept mistresses, fathered children, or were caught in scandalous affairs. Parishioners might whisper, bishops might look away, but the tension remained. The Church demanded purity, while its servants remained human. The moral theatre. Public sermons thundered against sins of the flesh, painting lurid images of eternal fire for adulterers and fornicators. Yet, these sermons often betrayed fascination as much as condemnation. The preacher who described the punishments of hell in exquisite detail was also, perhaps unknowingly, feeding the imagination of his audience. Sin was not only feared, but also pictured, contemplated, and remembered. The power of penance. To fall into sexual sin did not always mean ruin. Confession and penance provided a path back. A man who strayed with another's wife might be sentenced to pilgrimages, fasting, or the recitation of countless prayers. A woman accused of fornication might endure public shame but still be readmitted to the sacrament. Forgiveness was possible, but only after humiliation and repentance. The Church's control, therefore, was not simply about punishment, but about ritualized forgiveness binding souls ever tighter to its authority. Sex and the sacred calendar. One of the strangest aspects of medieval sexual regulation was the calendar itself. Couples were expected to abstain not only on holy days, but also during menstruation, pregnancy, and even while breastfeeding. Such restrictions meant that sex, though not forbidden, was carefully hemmed in, circumscribed by walls of doctrine. Love was allowed only under the shadow of rules. The unwritten reality. Of course, doctrine and reality rarely aligned perfectly. In farmhouses, behind taverns, or in castle chambers, men and women did not always heed the prohibitions thundered from pulpits. Passion flared despite the warnings. To be human was to err, and in the eyes of the church, nearly everyone erred. This gap between ideal and reality was where medieval sexuality truly lived, between sermon and sin, between confession and desire. Closing reflection. The medieval church sought to build walls around the human body, declaring when and how it might act upon its own impulses. Yet the more it condemned, the more it revealed an obsession with the very thing it tried to suppress. Was the church protecting souls from sin, or was it, by speaking so much of desire, giving it even greater life in memory and imagination? The bells that rang for weddings in the Middle Ages were not the chimes of romance. They were the toll of contract, the sealing of alliance, the echo of duty. Beneath flower garlands and festive feasts, most marriages were less about love than about survival, inheritance, and the binding of families. And yet, in the quiet of the marital bed, beneath the rough linen sheets, there were moments where obligation softened into tenderness, and desire slipped through the cracks of duty. Marriage as a transaction. In medieval Europe, marriage was rarely the union of two hearts. For nobles and royalty, it was a political weapon, binding kingdoms together, securing peace, or expanding territory. A young princess might be betrothed before she could walk, promised as part of a treaty. A noble son might be married off to secure a dowry that would lift his family's fortunes. For peasants, marriage was a matter of practical survival. A man needed a wife to manage the household, spin cloth, and bear children who could work the fields. A woman needed a husband to provide land, protection, and status. Love, if it appeared, was a fortunate accident. The church and consent. Yet paradoxically, the church also introduced a revolutionary idea. Marriage required the consent of both bride and groom. This doctrine meant that, in theory, a marriage could not be forced without the willingness of both parties. In practice, however, family pressure, economic necessity, and political strategy often overwhelmed personal choice. Still, records exist of brides and grooms resisting unions, fleeing with lovers, or seeking annulments when coerced. Sex as obligation. Within marriage, sex was framed less as passion and more as duty. Husbands owed their wives the marital debt, and wives owed the same to their husbands. Denial of intimacy could be grounds for annulment, yet desire was treated with suspicion. Intimacy was for procreation, not pleasure. Manuals and sermons advised moderation, warning couples not to indulge too often, lest their souls fall into sin. Still, we cannot imagine these marriages as joyless beds. Between duty and devotion, moments of closeness surely blossomed. Couples shared laughter, warmth in the cold winters, and the quiet intimacy of partnership forged through toil and time. Love in unexpected places. Though arranged, some marriages grew into genuine love. Letters from husbands to wives, rare but preserved, speak of longing during absences, of tender concern, of devotion that transcended duty. The medieval world allowed little room for romantic expression, but when it emerged, it carried a quiet intensity, precisely because it was rare. The dark side of obligation. Not all marriages were gentle. Women, often married in their teens to older men, found themselves trapped in unions where consent was theoretical at best. Domestic violence, though condemned in theory, was tolerated in practice. A wife's body was considered her husband's right, and her refusal could be seen as defiance. Love was preached as virtue, but obedience was demanded as law. The widow and the freedom of choice. Interestingly, widows held a unique position in medieval society. Having fulfilled their duty in one marriage, they sometimes found unexpected freedom in choosing a second. Some remarried for love, while others embraced independence, controlling their property and remaining unattached. Widows thus stood as rare figures who could step outside the rigid mold of marital duty. The bed as battlefield. For many, the marital bed was the place where power, obligation, and tenderness collided. Some couples found harmony, others endured silent misery. The records that survive from court cases to sermons speak of a society where love was secondary to lineage, but where human beings still sought connection beneath the weight of duty. Closing reflection. Marriage in the Middle Ages was a paradox, an institution built on duty, yet haunted by desire. It chained hearts in contracts, yet sometimes set them free in love. Perhaps this is the lesson: the line between duty and desire is not fixed but shifting, as fragile and fluid as the hearts of those who live it. The hall was lit by torches, and music drifted through the air as troubadours sang verses of impossible devotion. A knight, armored in valor but trembling in heart, gazed at the lady who could never be his. She sat above him, draped in silks, untouchable, a symbol of purity and longing. Around them, the medieval court feasted, but in the songs and whispers, another feast stirred, the feast of forbidden desire, the birth of courtly love. In the 12th century, across the courts of southern France and spreading through Europe, a new idea began to shape culture: fin amour, or courtly love. Unlike the contractual, duty-bound marriages of the time, courtly love celebrated passion outside the bonds of wedlock. It was the adoration of a knight for a noble lady, often his lord's wife, always unattainable, always dangerous. This love was not consummated in most tales. Instead, it thrived in longing, in secrecy, in the stolen glance or the coded song. To love was to suffer, to yearn, to be transformed into a better knight, a nobler soul. Desire was sanctified by distance. The troubadours' songs. Poets and musicians, troubadours and trouvères, composed verses that sang of burning hearts, sleepless nights, and the agony of desire denied. These songs spread through courts, creating a culture where noble men and women could flirt with ideas forbidden by church and marriage. The poems often played with paradox. Love was both salvation and torment, a sweetness laced with pain. For the listeners, such songs offered escape from the rigid structures of duty. They spoke of passion, risk, and the thrilling possibility of love that defied law and custom. The lady as ideal. In the world of courtly love, the lady was not a partner, but an idol. She was exalted, distant, often married, and unattainable. The knight's devotion was meant to elevate him spiritually, to refine his manners, courage, and chivalry. Yet beneath this spiritual language lay an undeniable erotic undercurrent. The lady was the flame, the knight the moth drawn to her brilliance, even if it burned him. Reality behind the fantasy. But how much of this was real and how much fantasy? While poets spun tales of noble yearning, real courts were filled with intrigue and scandal. Affairs did happen. Queens and noble women sometimes took lovers, risking ruin for passion. Noblemen, too, pursued desires beyond their arranged marriages. Courtly love provided a language to cloak these affairs, to dress lust in the garments of poetry. Danger and consequence. Forbidden love in reality carried grave risks. An adulterous affair could destroy reputations, invite accusations of treason, or end in brutal punishment. The songs romanticized longing, but rarely admitted the real dangers. Desire was intoxicating, but discovery was devastating. The shadow of the church. The church viewed courtly love with suspicion, sometimes outright condemnation. Love outside marriage was sin, no matter how beautifully sung. Yet even priests were not immune to the charm of poetry, and some manuscripts reveal clerical authors who dabbled in the language of desire. It was a cultural current too strong to be ignored. A lasting legacy. Courtly love shaped not only medieval culture, but the centuries that followed. The very idea of romantic love, as noble, transformative, and tied to suffering, owes much to these songs and tales. The knight's sigh, the lady's distant smile, the poetry of longing, they laid the foundation for modern notions of romance. Closing, reflection. Courtly love was both dream and danger, both art and transgression. It asked a timeless question: is love more powerful when it is fulfilled, or when it remains forever out of reach? Perhaps the answer lies in the silence between verses, in the memory of a glance that never became a touch. The glow of a hearth cast flickering light across a small timbered room. Smoke lingered in the rafters, straw crunched underfoot, and a rough-hewn bed stood at the center. A bed not for two, but for many. In the medieval village, privacy was a luxury unknown, and intimacy unfolded under the watchful eyes of family, neighbors, and custom. A shared world. For peasants, life was crowded. A single-room cottage might house parents, children, and sometimes livestock in winter. The bed, often just a wooden frame stuffed with straw or feathers, was a communal space. Parents, children, and even servants sometimes slept side by side. In this environment, intimacy between spouses was hardly hidden. It was conducted quietly, under blankets, while others pretended not to hear. Privacy, as we understand it today, simply did not exist. Sex was a natural part of life, woven into the rhythms of survival, observed with less delicacy but also less scandal than among the nobility. Betrothal and courting. Peasant unions were shaped less by dynastic politics than by practical need. A young man and woman might meet at village festivals, at church, or while working in the fields. Courtship often involved communal dances, songs, and rituals that carried strong undertones of fertility. Bundling customs, where a young couple was permitted to spend the night together in bed, fully clothed, or separated by a board, were tolerated in some regions. The line between courtship and intimacy was thin, and premarital relations, while frowned upon, were far from uncommon. Fertility and superstition. For peasant families, fertility was crucial. Children meant more hands for labor, more security in old age. Superstitions abounded. Charms were worn, herbs consumed, and prayers offered to saints to ensure conception. Some believed that lying beneath certain trees or drinking specific brews could increase fertility. At the same time, impotence or infertility could bring shame and suspicion. A barren marriage might be whispered about as cursed, and sometimes accusations of witchcraft followed when nature failed. Seasonal rhythms, sexual life in the village, followed the cycles of the year. Harvest festivals, midsummer celebrations, and May Day often carried erotic undertones, with dancing, drinking, and rituals that blurred the boundaries of propriety. These moments allowed young people to meet, flirt, and sometimes more. The church condemned such festivities as immoral, yet they persisted, for they were tied not only to desire but to hope for fertility of the fields and flocks. The earth itself was seen as a body needing to be renewed each year. Human intimacy mirrored this cycle. The weight of community. In small villages, nothing remained secret for long. Pregnancies out of wedlock were noticed, whispered about, and sometimes punished. A woman caught in fornication might be forced to stand in church in penance, her shame public. Yet at the same time, the community could be forgiving, for everyone understood that passion was as inevitable as hunger. Songs, jests, and humor. Peasant culture was filled with body songs, riddles, and jokes. Far from prudish, villagers often spoke of sex with humor and directness. Festivals featured ribald plays, and jesters or storytellers used sexual jokes to make people laugh. In laughter, the community found release from the strictures of work and faith, the hard edge of reality. Still, life for peasants was harsh. Early marriages meant teenage brides, sometimes wed to older men. Domestic violence, though rarely recorded, was common enough. Women's bodies were bound to childbirth, and mortality loomed large. Desire and intimacy were present, but they were always shadowed by toil, hunger, and the fragility of life. A different intimacy. Yet, amid hardship, tenderness existed. A couple who survived famine together, who raised children against all odds, who shared the same rough bed year after year, knew a bond deeper than passion. Love in the village was not sung by troubadours, but lived in daily acts. The husband repairing the roof, the wife tending the fire, the two lying together for warmth against winter's chill. Closing reflection. In the peasant bed, desire was not gilded with poetry or cloaked in secrecy. It was simple, raw, and human. It existed not in castles but in cottages, not in idealized longing, but in the struggle for survival. Perhaps here lies the truest lesson, that love and sex, stripped of ornament, remain what they always have been, threads of warmth in the cold weave of life. The streets of the medieval town were alive with noise vendors calling, carts rattling, bells tolling from the church tower. But as twilight fell, another set of doors opened. The brothel, with its flickering lamps, its laughter, its whispered promises. Here, in the heart of Christendom, sex was bought and sold, not in secrecy, but often under the sanction of city councils. The brothel was a paradox, a place where sin became policy, where vice was tolerated for the sake of order. The legal brothel. Unlike the hidden dens of later centuries, many medieval brothels were licensed by towns. City authorities reasoned that prostitution was a necessary evil, better contained than uncontrolled. By keeping it under regulation, they hoped to prevent worse sins, adultery, rape, and sodomy. St. Augustine himself had argued centuries earlier that without prostitutes, society would collapse into chaos, much as a palace without sewers would overflow with filth. Thus, the brothel became institutionalized. Municipal records from cities like Paris, London, and Avignon reveal regulations. Prostitutes were required to live in certain districts, wear distinctive clothing, and submit to inspections. The brothel keeper often paid taxes directly to the city. The women who worked there, most women who entered the trade, did not do so by choice. Poverty, abandonment, widowhood, or coercion drove them into prostitution. Some were sold by desperate families, others fled abusive homes or failed marriages. For many, the brothel offered a grim kind of security, shelter, meals, and the protection of city law, even if at the cost of dignity. Within the brothel, life was hard. Women were subject to the control of madams or municipal officials, their earnings heavily taxed, their bodies at constant risk of disease. Yet they also carved spaces of resilience. Some became wealthy enough to retire. Others left gifts to churches, seeking redemption through charity. The men who came. The clientele of brothels ranged from apprentices and laborers to students, soldiers, and even priests. Clerical decrees thundered against visiting prostitutes, but many clerics were among the most regular patrons. Some confessed their sins after, others justified them with the logic that using a prostitute was safer than seducing a virtuous woman. For soldiers, the brothel was considered almost an institution of military life, a place where discipline was managed through sanctioned indulgence. For students in university towns, it was both entertainment and initiation, morality and hypocrisy. The church condemned prostitution as sinful, but its tolerance was pragmatic. Better, they argued, to contain lust in the brothel than let it spill into the streets. Priests preached repentance for prostitutes, urging them to leave their trade, yet city governments kept taxing them. The result was a moral double bind. Women were both needed and despised, tolerated and condemned. Some saints, such as Mary Magdalene, were imagined as reformed prostitutes offering hope of redemption. Others, like theologian Thomas Aquinas, upheld the idea of prostitution as necessary to society. Much as scaffolding is to a building, it may be ugly, but without it, collapse would follow. Disease and fear. Brothels were also feared as breeding grounds of illness. Though syphilis would not devastate Europe until the late 15th century, other diseases and infections circulated widely. Medical texts and clerical warnings spoke of venereal dangers, yet remedies were few and often ineffective. Still, the brothel remained open, for the demand never waned. The silent stories. Amid regulations and sermons, the voices of the women themselves are faint but not absent. Court records tell of prostitutes assaulted by clients, fined for working outside approved districts, or punished for refusing service. Yet they also reveal women who sued for their rights, who resisted abuse, who carved dignity out of indignity. Their lives were lived in shadow, but their humanity endures in fragments. The brothel as social mirror. The brothel revealed the contradictions of medieval society more clearly than any pulpit or palace. It was where law, religion, and desire collided. Cities sought order. The church sought purity. Men sought pleasure. Women sought survival. Between these forces, the brothel endured, not hidden, but standing in plain sight, a testament to the uneasy truce between morality and necessity. Closing reflection. The medieval brothel was not only a house of sin, but a mirror held up to society. It showed a world that preached purity, but practiced compromise, that condemned women while depending on their bodies, that spoke of heaven while bowing to hunger and lust. Perhaps the deeper question is not why brothels existed, but why societies still find ways to sanctify their sins in the name of order. The monastery bell tolled in the cold morning air, summoning monks to prayer. The stone cloisters echoed with the sound of sandals, the rhythm of chants, the rustle of robes. Here, In these sacred walls, the flesh was meant to be subdued, desire silenced, the soul lifted toward heaven. And yet, within these very cloisters, the human body sometimes betrayed its vows. The cloister, meant to be a sanctuary of purity, was also a theater where the forbidden flesh staged its quiet rebellions. The ideal of celibacy. From the early Middle Ages, celibacy was presented as the highest form of devotion. Priests, monks, and nuns were expected to renounce marriage and carnal pleasure, dedicating themselves entirely to God. Virginity became a sacred state, a symbol of purity, a denial of the world's temptations. But the ideal was far easier to preach than to practice. Desire was not extinguished by walls of stone or vows spoken in solemn ceremony. It lingered in dreams, in stolen glances, in the aching solitude of the human body. Monastic struggles. Records from monasteries reveal confessions of brothers who struggled with the temptations of the flesh. Some were punished for secret affairs with women from nearby villages. Others were whispered to have found comfort in same-sex bonds with fellow monks. The same was true in convents. Women vowed to chastity sometimes bore children in secret, scandals hushed by powerful patrons. One 13th century chronicle describes a convent where nuns were accused of entertaining local men at night. Another speaks of abbots who kept mistresses, their hypocrisy quietly tolerated by superiors who feared scandal more than sin. The language of temptation. Confession manuals for monastics reveal how common such struggles were. Priests asked about unclean thoughts, about solitary sins, about forbidden touch. The very act of recording these temptations reveals a reality. The cloister was no haven immune to desire. It was a place where it simmered under pressure, sometimes exploding in scandal. Love behind the walls. Not all these relationships were fleeting or shameful. Some stories hinted bonds of deep affection, even love. Letters between clerics revealed tenderness, longing, and devotion beyond mere lust. Within the loneliness of cloistered life, companionship was a balm. What was condemned as sin may have been, for some, the only warmth in years of silence. Punishments and scandals. When discovered, transgressions could bring harsh punishment. A monk caught in an affair might be flogged, imprisoned, or expelled. A nun found pregnant could be disgraced, her convent shamed, her family ruined. Yet scandals did not end the system. They only proved how fragile the human struggle against desire remained. The Church's dilemma. The Church faced an impossible contradiction. On one hand, celibacy was upheld as a symbol of holiness. On the other, countless clerics failed to maintain it. Some bishops looked away, preferring not to damage the reputation of their orders. Others enforced strict reforms, seeking to purify the cloister. The cycle repeated across centuries. Vow, failure, reform, relapse. The spiritual struggle. Medieval monks wrote of battling demons in the night, sometimes literal, sometimes metaphorical. Temptation was often personified as the devil whispering into the ear, or as visions of women appearing in dreams. To resist was to wage spiritual warfare. To fall was to prove human weakness. But perhaps the greatest truth is this. The cloister was not only a place of prayer, but also a crucible of humanity. Those who lived within its walls were not angels. They were men and women, flesh and blood, struggling against the same desires as the peasants and kings outside. Closing reflection. The cloister teaches us that no vow can erase the human condition. Silence cannot drown desire, nor stone walls contain it. Perhaps holiness is not the absence of temptation, but the endurance of it. And perhaps the forbidden flesh reminds us of a deeper truth, that even in the pursuit of heaven we remain creatures of earth. Night fell quietly over the monastery courtyard, cloaking stone arches in silver light. Two figures lingered longer than the rule allowed, their words hushed, their steps close enough to touch. In a world where desire between men or between women was condemned as sin, such moments lived in shadow, fragile, fleeting, but undeniably human. Condemnation from the pulpit. From the perspective of the Church, same-sex intimacy was among the gravest of sins. Labeled sodomy, it was condemned in sermons, codified in canon law, and punished by civil courts. Medieval theologians, drawing on Augustine and later Thomas Aquinas, described it as unnatural, a corruption of divine order. Punishments ranged from penance to execution, depending on time and place. Yet the very force of condemnation hints at its persistence. If same-sex desire had been rare, the Church would not have written so much about it, nor legislated it so harshly. The monastic bonds, within monasteries and convents, where men and women lived separated from the opposite sex, emotional and sometimes physical bonds formed naturally. Confession manuals asked priests to probe into sins with one's own sex, revealing how common these concerns were. Chroniclers recorded scandals of abbots accused of favoring young monks, or nuns forming inappropriate attachments to one another. But to dismiss these bonds only as sin would be to miss their depth. Letters, poems, and chronicles hint at tenderness and devotion. For some, companionship blossomed into love, a balm for the loneliness of cloistered life. Poetry and desire. Outside the cloister, traces of same-sex affection survive in literature. In Arabic Spain, poets celebrated the beauty of young men in verses of longing. In medieval France, songs and tales occasionally hinted at bonds between women. Even in England, legal records show accusations of women dressing as men to live with female lovers. Such fragments remind us that desire often finds a voice, however veiled, in allegory, in coded language, in whispered song. Medieval men and women expressed what law forbade. The punishments. When same-sex relationships came to light, consequences could be severe. In some kingdoms, men convicted of sodomy were burned at the stake. Women were less frequently prosecuted but could still face humiliation, exile, or corporal punishment. Yet most such cases came to trial only when scandal erupted, when neighbors reported suspicions, or when political enemies sought to ruin reputations. Love in the shadows. For most, same-sex love had to remain hidden. A glance across a refectory table, a letter coded in ambiguous phrases, a night of whispered conversation. These were the fragile spaces where desire lived. Silence was survival, but memory preserved what law sought to erase. The quiet resilience. Despite fear and condemnation, same-sex love endured. It endured in monasteries, in courts, in villages, in secret places where human hearts met against the dictates of law. It endured because love cannot be erased by decree, nor longing destroyed by fear. Closing reflection. The story of same-sex love in the Middle Ages is a story of shadows of desires, hidden, punished, yet persistent. Perhaps the greatest lesson is this: what survives in fragments of poetry and whispers in chronicles is not only sin or scandal, but resilience. Even in an age of persecution, love found a way to exist, quietly, stubbornly, in the spaces where silence itself became a kind of sanctuary. A dim chamber, the smell of herbs thick in the air, sage, rue, and rosemary drying from the rafters, A midwife murmured charms as she mixed honey with powdered roots, offering her patient a potion to stir the womb. In the Middle Ages, sex was not only passion or sin, it was medicine, survival, and mystery. To conceive a child, to avoid conception, to heal the ailments of desire, all of these lay at the crossroads of medicine and magic. The medical worldview. Medieval medicine was rooted in the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on their balance, and sex was believed to play a vital role in this equilibrium. Intercourse, physicians argued, could release excess humours, restore balance, and promote well-being. Too much abstinence was thought to cause melancholy. Too much indulgence could weaken the body. Medical texts, often translated from Arabic scholars like Avicenna, devoted entire sections to sexuality, its dangers, its cures, and its benefits. For medieval doctors, sex was not separate from health. It was part of the body's natural rhythm. Fertility and conception. To conceive a child was seen as both a blessing and a necessity. Yet the process was poorly understood. Many believed conception required orgasm in both man and woman, for only then did the seeds mingle. Others thought the womb could open or close, depending on the woman's desire. Midwives and healers offered remedies for barrenness. Baths in special herbs, diets rich in warming foods, prayers to saints like Anne or Margaret. Sometimes couples were told to lie beneath certain constellations or at auspicious times of the moon. The blending of astrology with medicine gave fertility an air of cosmic destiny. Aphrodisiacs and potions. The medieval appetite for aphrodisiacs was insatiable. Recipes survive for concoctions made from pepper, ginger, cloves, or even ground animal organs. Honey, wine, and almonds were believed to quicken desire. One text recommended roasted wolf's liver to restore manhood. At the same time, potions to dampen desire or prevent pregnancy circulated quietly. Herbs such as pennyroyal and rue were used as contraceptives or abortifacients, though often with dangerous side effects. Women, more than men, carried this hidden knowledge, passed through midwives, healers, and folk traditions. Impotence and fear. Impotence was one of the most dreaded conditions for men, for it threatened not only pride, but lineage. Explanations ranged from humoral imbalance to witchcraft. Courts sometimes heard cases where wives sought annulment because their husbands were unable. In some instances, men were forced to prove potency before witnesses, a humiliating ordeal that blended medicine with law. Magic was often blamed. Spells, charms, or curses were said to steal a man's virility. To cure this, counter-charms were prescribed, wearing certain amulets, reciting prayers, or burning herbs in the bedroom. The female body and mystery. The female body was shrouded in greater mystery. Medical texts, written mostly by men, often portrayed women as cold, moist, and prone to imbalance. Menstruation was seen as both cleansing and dangerous, its blood imagined as toxic. Sexual desire in women was alternately dismissed as weak or feared as insatiable. Yet women themselves, through midwives and folk healers, carried a more practical knowledge. They knew how to ease the pains of childbirth, how to encourage conception, and how to end it when desperation demanded. This hidden knowledge, later condemned as witchcraft, was once simply survival. Saints, prayers, and miracles. Beyond herbs and humours, fertility was placed in the hands of saints. Pilgrimages to shrines of holy women were common for couples unable to conceive. Churches displayed relics, bones, cloths, drops of oil believed to bring blessings to the barren. In these acts, the line between medicine, magic, and faith blurred completely. The blend of science and superstition. To the medieval mind, there was no clear divide between medicine and magic. Astrology guided treatments, charms accompanied remedies, and faith framed all. A man might take an herbal potion, wear an amulet, and pray to a saint, believing all worked together. Closing reflection. In the Middle Ages, sex was not only a matter of desire, it was a matter of health, survival, and fate. Medicine, magic, and faith intertwined to shape the body's mysteries. Perhaps this is the enduring truth. When faced with the unknown, humanity reaches for every tool, science, spell, and prayer to grasp what is beyond control. The cry of betrayal often echoed louder than the toll of church bells. In the medieval world, where honor and lineage defined destiny, adultery was not just a private wound but a public crime. It was the spark that ignited scandals, the shadow that haunted noble courts, the shame that ruined peasants alike. To betray the marital bed was to risk more than love. It was to gamble with reputation, inheritance, and even life itself. The weight of betrayal. Marriage was a cornerstone of medieval society, binding not only two individuals but entire families, lands, and dynasties. Adultery threatened this structure. A wife's infidelity raised the specter of illegitimate heirs. A husband's betrayal weakened the sanctity of his vows, and at times risked political alliances. The sin was therefore condemned not merely as personal failure, but as social danger. The Church's condemnation. The Church thundered against adultery with unrelenting force. Sermons likened adulterers to Judas, betrayers of trust and faith. Penances were severe. Pilgrimages to holy shrines, years of fasting, public confession before the parish. Yet even in spiritual matters, hypocrisy lingered. Priests themselves were not immune to the temptation of another man's wife, and many scandals ended in hushed silence rather than exposure. Punishments of the law. Civil courts took adultery with brutal seriousness. In many regions, a woman caught in adultery could be stripped, paraded, or even executed. Men often faced lighter penalties, reflecting the patriarchal imbalance of the age. In some towns, adulterers were bound together and forced to march through the streets, mocked by jeering crowds. Among nobles, punishments varied according to politics. Some queens accused of adultery were imprisoned, annulled, or sent to convents. Others, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose rumored affairs scandalized Europe, escaped ruin through power and cunning. Scandal in the courts. Adultery among the aristocracy often became a matter of public intrigue. Chronicles whisper of kings betrayed, knights executed for illicit love, queens accused of passion beyond their station. These tales reveal both the harsh reality and the fascination surrounding scandal. Adultery was condemned, yet it captivated the medieval imagination, fueling stories, songs, and gossip. The most famous example may be the legend of Lancelot and Guinevere. Though a tale, it reflected a deeper truth: the fear and allure of forbidden love at the heart of power. Peasant infidelity. Among peasants, adultery was punished less dramatically but no less harshly. Village courts often fined offenders or forced public penance. A wife found guilty might be shamed at the church door, her hair shorn, her body whipped. A husband's betrayal, though frowned upon, was more often tolerated, revealing once again the unequal burden placed upon women. The role of jealousy. Jealousy was not only personal but communal. Neighbors watched one another, and gossip often served as the spark for accusations. In small villages where privacy was scarce, a single rumor could become proof. Courts were filled with cases where witnesses testified to having seen too much familiarity between man and woman. The quiet resistance. And yet, despite all the prohibitions, adultery persisted. Love or lust could not be fully caged. Some affairs endured for years in secrecy, hidden behind closed shutters and coded letters. Some lovers fled together, abandoning everything for passion. For a few, desire outweighed duty, no matter the cost. The paradox of fascination. Medieval culture condemned adultery, yet it also romanticized it. Tales of Tristan and Isolde, of Guinevere and Lancelot, of countless ballads and poems celebrated love that defied law and vow. Society punished the act but cherished the story, condemning the flesh while feeding the imagination. Closing reflection. Adultery in the Middle Ages reveals a paradox, a sin despised yet endlessly retold, a crime punished yet secretly admired. Perhaps the truth is, this society feared adultery not because it was rare, but because it was universal. To love outside duty is to follow the heart against the world, and that, in any age, is both tragedy and temptation. In the candlelit chapels of the Middle Ages, statues of the Virgin Mary glowed with quiet radiance. Draped in blue, her gaze lowered in serene humility. She was not merely a symbol of holiness, but of an entire cultural ideal. Purity untouched, desire conquered, the body unmarked by passion. Around her image grew an obsession that shaped the lives of women, men, saints, and sinners alike. The cult of virginity. Virginity in medieval Europe was not only a personal state, but a social currency. The untouched body was exalted as sacred, and chastity was equated with holiness. Saints' lives celebrated virgin martyrs who resisted kings, soldiers, or demons rather than surrender their purity. Their stories often ended in brutal deaths, yet their reputations shone brighter than queens. For young women, virginity was not simply a virtue but a demand. A maiden's worth in marriage negotiations depended heavily on her untouched status. Families guarded daughters fiercely, for chastity was not only a moral issue but a financial and political one. The virgin bride. Wedding rituals placed immense emphasis on the bride's purity. Veils symbolized modesty, hymns praised chastity, and legal contracts assumed the woman's untouched state. A woman accused of premarital intimacy might find her marriage annulled or her dowry withheld. Virginity was therefore less a personal choice than a commodity, controlled by fathers, husbands, and the church. Tests and proofs. The anxiety over virginity led to strange practices. In some places, consummation was expected to prove marriage valid, with witnesses sometimes waiting outside the bridal chamber. A blood-stained sheet might be displayed as evidence of the bride's virtue. Failure to produce such proof could bring shame, annulment, or scandal. Of course, the body did not always cooperate with cultural myth. Many women were falsely accused of impurity simply because their anatomy did not conform to expectation. Others sought remedies, potions, charms, or even surgical methods to restore the appearance of virginity. Virginity and male purity. Though female virginity was most emphasized, men were not exempt. Clerics, monks, and knights who took vows of chastity were expected to embody purity as spiritual strength. Virgin knights were praised in poetry, their self-control celebrated as nobility. Yet, unlike women, men's worth was not destroyed if they failed. Male purity was admired but not demanded. The paradox of purity. The cult of virginity created paradoxes. Saints' lives often dwelled obsessively on the very sexuality they condemned, describing in detail the assaults resisted by holy women. Art and literature exalted purity, but often depicted it through scenes of threatened violation. Desire was thus both denied and constantly evoked. Mary as model and burden. Above all, the Virgin Mary stood as the supreme model of purity. She was mother and maiden, fertile yet untouched, embodying an impossible paradox. For ordinary women, this ideal was both comfort and burden. To emulate Mary was to live in perpetual restraint, to embody virtue defined by absence rather than presence, rebellion against the ideal. Not all submitted quietly. Some women rejected marriage altogether, choosing convent life where virginity became power rather than weakness. Within the cloister, purity was transformed into authority, allowing nuns to rise as leaders, mystics, and visionaries. Others resisted in silence, defying the pressure to be defined solely by what their bodies had not done. The fragile symbol, virginity in the Middle Ages, was less about flesh than about control. Control of women's bodies, of inheritance, of morality itself. It was a fragile symbol, always at risk of shattering, yet endlessly enforced. A woman could lose it in an instant, through choice or through force, but she could rarely reclaim her place in society once it was gone. Closing reflection. Virginity was praised as purity, but functioned as power over women, over marriage, over lineage. It raised saints and destroyed reputations, sanctified mothers and burdened daughters. Perhaps the lesson is this: purity defined by absence is a dangerous idol, for it measures worth not by what a person is, but by what they have never done. The medieval marketplace buzzed with gossip as much as with trade. A noble woman passed in silks, and whispers followed her steps, rumors of lovers, of secrets, of sins. In the Middle Ages, a woman's reputation was her armor or her noose. Sexuality was not only private, but profoundly political, shaping the destinies of queens and peasants alike. Queens in the crosshairs. For women of power, sexuality was a double-edged sword. A queen's fidelity determined dynasties. One accusation of adultery could delegitimize heirs and shatter kingdoms. Chronicles abound with scandal. Eleanor of Aquitaine, queen of both France and England, was dogged by rumors of affairs, her independence fueling accusations of lust. Isabella of France, known as the she-wolf of France, was accused of betrayal with her lover Roger Mortimer, her reputation painted in scandal to justify her enemies' hatred. These accusations were often political weapons, wielded by rivals to weaken women whose intelligence or authority threatened the established order. The seductress and the witch. Powerful women were often framed as seductresses, their influence explained not by wit, but by sinful charms. Queens, noble women, and even widows with wealth were accused of using their sexuality to sway men. When such charges escalated, the line between seductress and witch blurred. Women accused of witchcraft were often said to ensnare men through lust, coupling with demons, poisoning desire itself. Thus, sexuality became not only scandal, but sorcery, another tool to strip women of legitimacy. The peasant woman's reputation. Among commoners, a woman's sexual reputation shaped her survival. A maiden accused of promiscuity risked losing prospects of marriage. A wife rumored to stray risked public penance, humiliation, or worse. In small villages where everyone knew each other, a single whisper could carry for generations. Yet women also used reputation as a kind of power. Some leaned into bawdy humor, commanding spaces in taverns or marketplaces with boldness that shocked the pious. Others cultivated reputations for chastity and virtue, gaining respect and protection. Widows and freedom. Widows occupied a special space. Having fulfilled their duty in one marriage, they sometimes embraced newfound freedom. Some controlled estates, ran businesses, or even chose lovers without the scrutiny faced by maidens. But power always came with risk. A wealthy widow too independent might quickly be branded wanton. Mistresses and influence. The role of the mistress in noble courts reveals how sexuality could translate into political sway. While officially condemned, mistresses of kings often wielded extraordinary influence, distributing favors, shaping court politics, even advising policy. Some, like Agnes Sorel, mistress of Charles VII of France, were both reviled and admired. Yet their position was precarious. Adored one moment, discarded the next, their reputations destroyed when beauty faded or favor waned. The Church and the female body. The Church's teachings reinforced this fragile dynamic. Women were portrayed as temptresses, heirs of Eve, responsible for men's sins. Sermons warned men against female allure, while demanding that women remain silent, chaste, and obedient. Yet the very intensity of these warnings reveals the fear women's sexuality inspired the belief that it could topple kings, ruin priests, and unravel order itself. The power of rumor. In the medieval world, truth mattered less than perception. A rumor could destroy faster than a sword. Women lived under constant surveillance. Their bodies, their voices, their behavior weighed and judged. Their sexuality was never fully their own. It belonged to fathers, husbands, the church, or the court of public opinion. Closing reflection. In the Middle Ages, a woman's sexual reputation was not a private matter, but a public stage. It crowned queens and condemned them, protected maidens or ruined them, granted widows freedom or stripped it away. Perhaps the lesson is this: power and sexuality are never separate. To control one is to control the other, and in that struggle, women bore the heaviest weight. Behind the gilded curtains of medieval palaces, beyond the jeweled crowns and solemn councils, lay the most intimate battlefield of power, the royal bed. In those shadowed chambers, dynasties were forged, alliances sealed, and sometimes kingdoms undone. For kings and queens, sex was never merely private. It was a matter of state, of inheritance, of fate itself. Marriage as politics. Royal marriages were rarely stories of romance. They were treaties in human form, binding kingdoms together through flesh and blood. A princess sent abroad as bride was more than a daughter. She was a living bridge between nations. A king's union could secure peace or ignite war. Henry II of England's marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine bound vast lands together, changing the map of Europe. Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon's union centuries later would unify Spain under one crown. In each case, the bed was an extension of the throne, and the success of a marriage was judged not by affection but by heirs. The heir and the despair. The pressure on queens to produce sons was immense. Failure could mean humiliation, annulment, or even accusations of witchcraft or sin. Queens who bore only daughters often lived in fear of being set aside. Their bodies became political machines, judged by fertility. King Henry VIII of England would embody this obsession centuries later, discarding wives in pursuit of a male heir. But long before him, countless queens bore the same burden: to transform passion into dynasty, mistresses and scandal. While queens were bound to fidelity, kings often indulged in mistresses. Some were fleeting pleasures, others wielded lasting influence. Agnes Sorel, mistress of Charles VII of France, was celebrated for her beauty and became known as the first official royal mistress. She influenced court politics, setting a precedent for generations. In England, Edward IV's many affairs led to whispers of illegitimate children competing with royal heirs. Mistresses could be adored or reviled, praised as muses or damned as temptresses. Their position was both powerful and perilous, for their fortunes depended on the whims of passion. Queens and lovers. Though riskier, some queens also took lovers. Chroniclers, often hostile men, recorded rumors with relish. Isabella of France, Margaret of Anjou, and others were accused of betraying their kings, sometimes with evidence, sometimes only with malice. For a queen, even a whisper of infidelity could be catastrophic, casting doubt on the legitimacy of heirs and shaking the foundations of power. Beds as battlefields. Royal bedrooms were not only places of desire, but also of betrayal and intrigue. Lovers were smuggled through secret doors. Rivals spread rumors of impotence or infidelity. Spies lurked among servants, listening at chamber doors. The bedchamber was as political a stage as the throne room. At times, even the act of consummation was witnessed. In medieval France and England, newlyweds of noble birth might be escorted to their chamber, their union blessed and sometimes observed by attendants to ensure the legitimacy of heirs. The royal body was never fully private. It belonged to the realm, dynasty and desire. Yet amid duty and politics, desire still lived. Some royal couples defied expectations, forging genuine bonds of love. Letters between Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine reveal both passion and conflict, their union tempestuous but real. Others, like Ferdinand and Isabella, forged partnerships that were as affectionate as they were strategic. These rare unions remind us that even beneath crowns and banners, kings and queens were human longing for intimacy, struggling with jealousy, aching for connection, the fragility of reputation. Rumors of a king's impotence or a queen's adultery could topple thrones. Chronicles speak of whispered scandals destroying alliances, of wars justified by accusations of illegitimacy. A royal bed was therefore never simply a bed. It was a ledger of legitimacy, a vault of secrets, a fulcrum upon which the destiny of nations turned. Closing reflection. In the bedroom of kings and queens, love was never free. It was chained to duty, to lineage, to the weight of kingdoms. Yet even under such burdens, passion flared, scandals erupted, and tenderness bloomed in rare moments. Perhaps the lesson is this: even on thrones of gold, the heart is not immune to the same longings, betrayals, and desires that rule every human life. The cathedral walls rose high into the heavens, carved with saints and angels. Yet hidden among the sacred figures were mischievous carvings, men lifting their tunics, women revealing themselves, grotesques locked in obscene poses. The medieval world, so often remembered for its solemn piety, was also filled with laughter, bawdy stories, and art that gave voice to the body's unspoken hungers. Desire lived not only in secret acts, but in the language of poetry, song, and image. The bawdy in sacred spaces. On the margins of illuminated manuscripts, monks doodled erotic scenes. In the stone of cathedrals, masons carved figures exposing themselves. Scholars debate their meaning. Were they warnings against sin, playful satire, or simple mischief of craftsmen? Whatever the intent, they reveal a world where sexuality was never fully silenced. even within the walls of the holy. Chaucer and the Tales of the Flesh. In England, Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales captured this duality with brilliance. Amid stories of saints and pilgrims, he included ribald tales of lusty clerks, adulterous wives, and foolish husbands. His humor was earthy, his characters alive with desire. The laughter that rang from these tales was not mere comedy. It was recognition, an acknowledgement that beneath robes and titles all shared the same appetites. The fabliaux. Across France and beyond, short comic tales known as fabliaux thrived. These stories, told by minstrels in taverns and courts, were filled with tricksters, cheating lovers, and bawdy escapades. They mocked hypocrisy, especially that of priests and husbands, and celebrated clever wives and daring youths. Desire, in these tales, was again a source of laughter rather than shame. Erotic poetry. Troubadours sang not only of courtly love, but sometimes of more explicit passions. Verses spoke of kisses stolen in gardens, of bodies described with frank admiration. In Arabic Spain, poets celebrated both male and female beauty with sensual detail, blending the spiritual with the erotic. These poems remind us that even in an age of rigid morality, art gave space to the rawness of human longing. The visual language. Beyond words, medieval art offered a language of desire. Illuminations sometimes depicted Adam and Eve with surprising intimacy, or allegories of lust disguised as moral lessons. Carnival plays and festival masks allowed performers to parody sexuality openly, mocking the very rules that governed them. In laughter and image, people found release from the weight of sin. Humor as survival. Humor was essential in a world shadowed by plague, famine, and war. Bawdy stories, obscene carvings, and satirical songs reminded people that desire was part of survival, a spark of joy against the darkness. Laughter turned the forbidden into the familiar, easing the tension between body and soul, desire and the written word. Yet, not all was playful. Some works spoke with tenderness of longing, of the pain of separation, of the sweetness of touch remembered. In these writings, desire was not mere lust, but love, fragile and profound. Such texts bridge the centuries, reminding us that medieval men and women loved as deeply as they laughed. The hidden continuity. What is striking is not only that medieval art contained so much desire, but that it often did so openly. Far from a prudish silence, the culture carried a dual voice, solemn in church, bawdy in song, sacred in the sermon, playful in the tavern. The language of desire was everywhere, woven into the fabric of daily life. Closing reflection. Art and literature preserved what society sought to regulate: the body, its laughter, its longing. In carvings and tales, humanity found ways to speak of what was forbidden. Perhaps the lesson is this: desire, like ink, leaves its trace. No law, no sermon, no fear can erase what the human heart insists on expressing, whether in stone, in song, or in story. The courtroom was dim, the air heavy with murmurs. At the center stood the accused, trembling beneath the judge's gaze. Their crime was not theft nor murder, but the breaking of invisible boundaries, the laws of the flesh. In the Middle Ages, sexuality was not left to conscience alone. It was written into codes, judged in courts, and punished in public squares. Desire itself was a matter of justice. Law as moral guardian. Medieval lawmakers believed that the health of society depended on regulating sex. just as guilds kept order among craftsmen, and lords kept order among peasants, laws kept order among bodies. To sin against sexual law was not merely a private failing, it was a disruption of the community, a threat to inheritance, morality, and divine favor. Adultery and betrayal. Adultery, especially by women, was one of the most serious offenses. Local courts punished it with public shame, whippings, or exile. In noble circles, accusations could lead to annulment, imprisonment, or execution. The harshness reflected more than morality. It reflected fear of illegitimate heirs who might destabilize dynasties. A queen, accused of infidelity, imperiled kingdoms. A peasant wife, accused of the same, imperiled honor and lineage. Incest and forbidden bonds. Incest, broadly defined, was another focus of law. The Church prohibited marriages within 7 degrees of kinship, later reduced to 4. This encompassed distant cousins, in-laws, and spiritual kin. Couples found to have violated these rules could have their marriages annulled, children declared illegitimate, and lands seized. These prohibitions were not only moral, but political tools to control alliances, redistribute land, and strengthen the Church's role in family life. Sodomy and the unnatural. Perhaps the most feared accusation was sodomy, a term that encompassed homosexual acts, non-procreative sex, and sometimes even excessive marital passion. Punishments varied. In some towns it meant penance, in others, burning at the stake. Accusations were often politically motivated, used to silence rivals or destroy reputations. The severity of sodomy laws reveals more than intolerance. It reveals anxiety. By defining natural strictly as procreative sex within marriage, society sought to bind the body to duty, fearing the chaos of unchecked desire, bestiality, and the boundaries of shame. Court records also describe cases of bestiality, often treated with shocking severity. Both human and animal were sometimes executed, the act seen as contaminating creation itself. These cases, though rare, reveal the extent to which sexuality was policed as a matter of cosmic order. The public spectacle. Punishments for sexual crimes were rarely private. Public shaming was central. Adulterers paraded through streets, sodomites burned in public squares, fornicators forced to confess at church doors. The community became witness and judge, reinforcing moral order through spectacle. Yet the same crowds that jeered may also have been entertained, their own suppressed desires stirred by the drama of punishment. The law, in this sense, was both terror and theatre. The double standard. As in so much of medieval life, law was harsher on women. A wife accused of infidelity could lose everything. A husband's affairs were often overlooked. Women bore the greater burden of honor, their bodies seen as the vessels of lineage. Men's transgressions were sins, women's were betrayals, resistance and evasion. Despite the severity, people found ways to evade the law. Bribes softened punishments, powerful patrons intervened, and communities sometimes chose silence over exposure. Behind official codes lay a quieter reality. Many sins remained unpunished, whispered about, but never brought to court. Closing reflection. The law sought to govern the flesh, but the flesh often slipped its chains. In punishing desire, society revealed its own fears, its need to bind the uncontrollable. Perhaps the lesson is this: no law, however harsh, can fully master the human heart. The courtroom may pass judgment, but desire continues its silent rebellion. The clash of swords, the smoke of burning villages, The cries of the defeated amid the chaos of medieval war, the body became yet another battlefield. For all the hymns of chivalry and sermons of holy crusade, armies carried not only banners but hunger, not only faith but lust. In the shadow of war, sexual violence left scars deeper than wounds of steel, shaping memory, fear, and silence. Rape as a weapon of war. Throughout the Middle Ages, chronicles record that when cities fell, rape often followed. Conquered women were treated as spoils, their bodies extensions of the enemy's defeat. Such acts were not random, but systematic, a weapon to humiliate, to terrorize, to assert domination. From the Viking raids to the sack of Constantinople in 1204, witnesses wrote of women assaulted in homes, in churches, even before altars. Rape in war was not only cruelty, it was communication, a message to survivors that their honor, lineage, and future were broken. The church's condemnations. Clerics thundered against such crimes, condemning rape as mortal sin, especially when committed by Christians against fellow Christians. Yet when enemies were deemed infidels or heretics, moral boundaries blurred. The rhetoric of holy war sometimes excused atrocities, casting them as divine vengeance. Sermons that preached purity at home often fell silent before the realities of battlefield lust. The Crusades and sexual temptation. The Crusades, launched in the name of God, were haunted by the sins they sought to expel. Pilgrims and soldiers traveling to the Holy Land encountered new cultures, brothels near encampments, and temptations of flesh amid the holy cause. Chroniclers record priests lamenting the sexual excesses of crusader camps, even as armies prepared to march under the sign of the cross. The paradox was stark. Men vowed to fight for the purity of Jerusalem while indulging in the very sins their priests condemned. The captive and the slave. War produced captives, men, women, and children sold into slavery. For women, enslavement almost always carried sexual exploitation. Captive concubines were kept in noble households. Peasant women were taken by soldiers. Some chroniclers describe women forced into concubinage with their captors, their lives forever shaped by the violence of war. For the conqueror, such acts were framed as right of victory. For the victim, they became silent traumas, rarely recorded, but deeply endured. Soldiers and civilian women, even outside official campaigns, roaming bands of mercenaries, terrorized villages, known as free companies. These soldiers often lived off plunder, their violence unchecked by lords or kings. Women in their path were vulnerable, their suffering often dismissed as the inevitable price of war. The silence of records. What is most haunting is the silence. While chronicles describe battles in detail, they often reduce women's suffering to a single line. The city was taken, the women dishonored. Behind those words lay countless untold stories, bodies scarred, families broken, lives extinguished, not by sword but by shame. Resistance and protection. Communities did attempt to resist. Some women disguised themselves as men, fleeing before armies arrived. Others sought sanctuary in churches, though even holy walls could not always protect them. Kings and lords sometimes punished soldiers for rape, not out of compassion, but to maintain discipline and protect property rights. Yet such punishments were exceptions, not the rule. The legacy of violence. Sexual violence in medieval war left legacies that endured for generations. Children born of rape faced stigma. Women bore lifelong trauma, and entire communities carried memory of violation as part of their history. The scars were not only personal but collective, shaping the culture of fear and silence around sex itself. Closing reflection. War reveals the fragility of morality. The same men who prayed for salvation committed unspeakable acts. The same society that praised chastity condoned violation in conquest. Perhaps the lesson is this: when desire is unmoored from compassion, it becomes a weapon sharper than any sword. And in the shadows of war, the human body bears the cost of humanity's darkest ambitions. The night was long, the air heavy with the scent of smoke and herbs. A woman cried out in labor, her body trembling as neighbors gathered, whispering prayers. At her side knelt the midwife, calm, practiced, hands steady in the chaos. In the Middle Ages, midwives carried knowledge, both feared and revered. They understood the mysteries of the female body in ways physicians and priests did not. Their wisdom lived in whispers, in touch, in remedies passed from one woman to another. Guardians of birth. Childbirth was the most dangerous passage in a woman's life. Physicians, educated men, rarely attended the birthing chamber. It was a women's space, and the midwife reigned there. She knew how to position the mother, when to cut the cord, which herbs eased pain, which prayers calmed fear. Her skill could mean life or death for mother and child. In many towns, midwives were licensed by the church or civic authorities, tasked with ensuring not only health but morality. They were expected to baptize infants in emergencies, to watch for signs of illegitimacy, even to testify in cases of disputed virginity. Thus, their hands touched both life and law, keepers of sexual knowledge. Beyond birth, midwives were often consulted in matters of fertility and desire. They prepared charms to help barren women conceive, concocted remedies to restore a man's potency, or whispered secrets to prevent pregnancy. They knew which herbs could bring menstruation, and which might quietly end it. This knowledge, practical and ancient, existed in tension with the Church's teachings. What priests condemned as sin, women often treated as survival. To control the body was to claim a measure of power in a world that gave women little: suspicion and witchcraft. Because of this knowledge, midwives often lived under suspicion. When childbirth ended in tragedy, as it often did, they could be accused of negligence, or worse, of witchcraft. Their familiarity with herbs and charms, their presence in the liminal space between life and death, made them vulnerable. By the late Middle Ages, as witch hunts grew, midwives were among the first accused. Manuals of demonology claimed they consorted with devils, killing infants or offering them to demons. What had once been valued, knowledge became demonized, twisted into fear. The female body as mystery. To medieval medicine, the female body was shrouded in ignorance and superstition. Male physicians wrote of wombs wandering inside the body, of menstrual blood as poison, of women as cold and moist by nature. Their theories revealed more about fear than fact. Against this backdrop, midwives offered practical wisdom knowledge, born of experience rather than theory. They knew the rhythms of fertility, the signs of pregnancy, the dangers of miscarriage. Their remedies were not always effective, but they were grounded in generations of trial and memory, secrets and solidarity. The birthing chamber was also a place of community. Women gathered to support the laboring mother, singing hymns or telling stories to ease her fear. Midwives stood at the center of this circle of solidarity. In these spaces, away from men, women shared not only pain, but laughter, stories, and knowledge of the body. Here, sexuality was spoken of frankly, without the sermons of priests or the judgments of law. Desire, fertility, and the female body were part of life, not sin. The secrets midwives carried were not only medical but cultural, a shared inheritance of women's wisdom, the shadow of mortality. Yet childbirth remained perilous. Many women died in labor, their lives cut short in the very act of giving life. Midwives often carried the grief of these losses, blamed by families, haunted by failure, even when no skill could have changed fate. Their work was both sacred and tragic, their lives spent on the threshold between joy and sorrow. Closing reflection. Midwives embodied the paradox of the Middle Ages, respected and needed, yet feared and condemned. They were guardians of life, keepers of secrets, healers in a world of ignorance. Perhaps their greatest lesson is this: knowledge is power. And in a society that sought to control women, even the wisdom of birth and healing could be branded as dangerous. The drums beat, the torches blazed, and the air filled with the mingled scents of roasted meat, spilled ale, and crushed flowers beneath dancing feet. In the heart of the medieval year, when harvest was gathered or holy days arrived, towns and villages erupted into festival. For a few days, order loosened, hierarchies blurred, and the body was freed. The carnival was not just celebration, it was a rebellion of flesh, a ritualized escape from restraint. The festival of inversion. Carnival, held before the austerity of Lent, was the supreme festival of inversion. Servants mocked their masters, fools were crowned as kings, priests parodied their own rites, laughter roared where silence usually reigned. In this topsy-turvy world, sexuality too slipped its chains. Men dressed as women, women as men. Bawdy songs echoed in churchyards. Ribald plays mocked adultery, lust, and desire. The body, usually policed by church and law, became a spectacle of freedom. Masks allowed anonymity, and with it, the courage to break rules. May Day and fertility rituals. In the spring, May Day festivals celebrated fertility and renewal. Young men and women danced around the maypole, a towering symbol of life's generative force. Couples stole into the woods, and ballads hinted that many returned with more than flowers in their hair. Though condemned by priests as pagan remnants, these rituals endured. They reflected the agricultural truth. The fertility of the land was bound to the fertility of its people. Human intimacy and nature's cycles were celebrated together. The Feast of Fools. In cathedrals themselves, clerics sometimes joined the revels. During the Feast of Fools, subdeacons might dress as bishops, processions mocked liturgy, and crude humor mingled with sacred ritual. Though later banned, these festivities reveal the medieval recognition that even holy life needed release. For a moment, laughter and irreverence restored balance to a world of constant restraint. Bawdy plays and public humor. Street performers, actors, and jesters thrived during festivals. They staged mystery plays about saints and biblical tales, but also bawdy farces that delighted crowds. Adultery, cuckoldry, and lust became comic theater. What could not be said in daily life was shouted from stages, cloaked in humor. The people laughed, not only at others, but at themselves. Sexual desire, so often cast as sin, was momentarily reclaimed as common humanity. Wine, song, and excess. Festivals were marked by drinking, feasting, and song. Alehouses overflowed, troubadours sang verses both noble and obscene, and dances grew wilder as the night deepened. In such states, encounters were born, some fleeting, some remembered long after. The line between liberation and transgression blurred, and the Church, while condemning excess, tolerated festivals as necessary release. The Church's uneasy tolerance. Priests railed against festivals, warning that drunkenness led to sin, that bawdy plays dishonored God, that fertility rites bordered on paganism. Yet they also knew society needed them. Without release, repression might fester into revolt. Thus, festivals endured, condemned in sermon, celebrated in life. Moments of liberation. For peasants who lived under toil and law, these festivals were moments of rare freedom. A girl who could never speak freely might sing a bawdy verse without shame. A servant who bowed daily to his master might mock him in public without fear. Desire and laughter fused into a kind of liberation, however temporary. The shadow of consequence. Of course, not all ended in joy. Festivals sometimes led to fights, scandals, unwanted pregnancies, or crimes committed in drunken abandon. What was meant as release could spiral into disorder. Yet, the very risk was part of the vitality of carnival. It was chaos briefly allowed, then reabsorbed into order. Closing. Reflection. Festivals remind us that even in an age of restraint, the human spirit demanded freedom. For a night or a week, masks replaced laws, laughter replaced sermons, and the flesh danced without fear. Perhaps the lesson is this: joy itself is rebellion, and desire, when freed even briefly, becomes a song that echoes longer than silence. The flicker of torchlight illuminated the village square. A woman stood bound, accused not only of sorcery, but of lust beyond human measure. Her neighbors whispered of strange herbs, of midnight gatherings, of men bewitched by her glance. In the late Middle Ages, as fear of witchcraft spread like fire, sexuality became one of its most damning marks. To desire too freely, or to inspire desire in others, was to risk being branded a servant of demons. The demonization of desire. Churchmen increasingly linked sexuality with the devil's work. To fall into lust was not merely weakness, but evidence of demonic temptation. Women, considered more susceptible to the body, were cast as gateways for evil. The very act of seduction was reframed as sorcery, a spell upon the flesh, a corruption of divine order. Manuals of demonology, such as the infamous Malleus Maleficarum of the late 15th century, dwelt obsessively on sexual themes. Witches were accused of copulating with demons, of stealing men's potency, of gathering semen for dark rituals. These lurid accusations reveal less about real women than about male anxieties. Fear of being powerless before desire. Incubi and succubi. Medieval lore teemed with tales of incubi and succubi demons who assaulted men and women in their sleep. These spirits were blamed for nocturnal emissions, impotence, and unnatural lust. Victims swore they felt the weight of a figure pressing on their chest, the touch of hands, the heat of passion. Such stories blur the line between dream and reality, between guilt and fear. In truth, they reflect the Church's obsession with controlling desire, even in the privacy of thought. To sin in a dream was to be accused of consorting with demons. Herbs, charms, and suspicion. Midwives and healers, long trusted for their knowledge of fertility, became suspect. Herbs used to arouse desire or prevent conception were reframed as witchcraft. A love potion could be grounds for accusation. Even a woman's beauty, if it drew men to folly, might be called enchantment. Thus, ordinary acts of survival, controlling pregnancy, easing childbirth, stirring affection, were recast as crimes against God. Trials and confessions. Accused witches often faced interrogation under torture, where they confessed to impossible acts, flying to Sabbaths, coupling with devils, corrupting crops with sexual fluids. The sexual nature of these confessions reveals the obsession of the inquisitors as much as the terror of the accused. Women's bodies became canvases onto which society projected its deepest fears. Men and the mark of sin. Though women bore the brunt, men, too, were accused especially of sodomy or demonic lust. Male witches were said to lose their virility as punishment, their strength sapped by infernal pacts. In this way, the fear of the flesh ensnared both sexes, though women carried the heavier burden. The fear behind the fear. Why did sexuality become so central to witchcraft? Perhaps because it was the one force society could not fully tame. Desire crossed boundaries of marriage, class, and law. By blaming witches, communities externalized their guilt and fear. The problem was not the universality of lust, but the imagined seductress who caused it. The burning of the body, execution of witches was often staged as spectacle, with fire purging the carnal corruption. Yet these burnings revealed an irony. The very bodies condemned for their dangerous allure became the focus of public gaze in death. Even in punishment, society could not look away from the flesh it feared. Closing reflection. In the witch trials we see how fear of the body became fear of women, how desire was demonized when it slipped beyond control. Perhaps the lesson is this. When society refuses to accept the power of desire, it turns that power into a monster. But no fire, no accusation, no demonology could erase the truth. The flesh is not demonic, but human, fragile, and longing. The candles burn low. The feast has ended. The bells have fallen silent. The laughter of festivals echoes only in memory. Across the centuries, the Middle Ages linger in our imagination as an age of faith and fear, of swords and sanctity. Yet beneath the armor, beneath the robes, beneath the sermons, the body was always present, longing, trembling, seeking. To speak of medieval sex is not to mock or scandalize. It is to recognize that even in the most devout age, humanity could never silence the flesh. The contradiction of flesh and spirit. From the pulpit, priests thundered that lust was the road to damnation. From the law courts came harsh punishments for adultery, sodomy, and scandal. From the chronicles rose tales of queens ruined, witches burned, and lovers disgraced. Yet none of this stopped men and women from reaching for one another in the dark. The contradiction was never resolved. Sex was sin, but also life itself. Desire was fire condemned for its danger, yet indispensable for its warmth. Without it, there could be no heirs, no alliances, no survival. Society feared the flame, yet it could not live without it. The hidden human stories. In the great halls of kings, intimacy shaped dynasties. In the cloisters of monks, longing whispered against vows. In the villages, love was shared under blankets, while children slept nearby. In brothels, survival was bought and sold. In festivals, laughter turned sin into song. Each layer of medieval society carried its own version of the same truth. Desire cannot be erased. Even in punishment, the body remained central. Trials, spectacles, humiliations, all revealed an obsession with what they claimed to destroy. The law and the church sought control, but in their very efforts, they preserved the memory of what they feared, the legacy of silence and survival. Much of medieval sexuality is known to us only through fragments, confessions recorded by priests, court rulings, sermons, bawdy poems, whispered accusations. These fragments are colored by condemnation, yet through them we glimpse resilience. Lovers still met, women still protected one another with knowledge of herbs, men still found tenderness in bonds forbidden. The silences speak as loudly as the words. What was not written, what was erased, what survived only in rumor. Memory itself is a battlefield where the flesh struggles against forgetting. What we learn of ourselves. To study sex in the Middle Ages is to confront the continuity of human longing. We moderns may imagine ourselves freer, less bound by shame, but the echoes remain. We still struggle with morality and desire, with law and intimacy, with the tension between what society demands and what the heart craves. The medieval mirror shows us not how different they were, but how familiar. When a peasant couple laughed together by firelight, when a troubadour sang of longing, when a nun wept for forbidden love, they were not distant strangers, they were us, in another time, under another sky. The final reflection. The Middle Ages remind us that desire is both shadow and dawn. It can destroy, but it can also heal. It can be chained by law, yet it slips through locks. It can be feared as demonic, yet it is the force that binds families, sustains life, and inspires art. Perhaps that is the lesson carried across centuries. Sex is never only flesh. It is memory, identity, survival, rebellion, and hope. It is the quiet truth that no sermon could silence, no law could bind, no fire could erase. And so, as the last bell tolls and the candles gutter out, we leave the medieval world with this truth. Amid blood and faith, silence and song, humanity has always carried within it the same flame. To desire is to be human, and to be human is to carry both the shadow of sin and the light of love.